Ken, from Scottish Gaelic name Kenneth, means handsome. I will not comment about how handsome he is. But while the word may point to appearance, what truly stands out is something far more compelling, a mind that is elegant in structure and powerful in insight. Gichinga, from Kikuyu, means firebrand, and that's exactly who he is. Bold in thought, sharp in analysis, and unafraid to challenge conventional thinking around the economy. In a time where headlines move markets and uncertainty is constant, he helps leaders and institutions cut through noise and focus on what truly matters. Ken Gichinga is the founder and chief economist at Mintoria Economics. He leads a firm known for turning complex economic data into clear, actionable strategy. He previously served as senior economist at Equity Bank and Commercial Bank of Africa, now NCBA, and brings global experience from Microsoft Corporation in Seattle. A graduate of Harvard University and one of Business Daily's inaugural Top 40 Under 40, he's also trusted on Capital FM's Financial Forecasts, where he breaks down complex economic issues into practicable, accessible insights. He connects the dots from policy to people and from data to decisions. As we begin, let's sharpen our thinking as we better understand the forces shaping the economy and the Strait of Hormuz. Ladies and gentlemen, to deliver his State of the Economy address, please welcome a true firebrand in his field, Mr. Ken Gichinga.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning again. It's a great pleasure to be with the PDI family. It's an honor to be here again on this April morning, noon, here at Windsor in such a beautiful, beautiful garden. And I'm deeply humbled to have been invited here to speak to you on the state of the economy. Indeed, see what the Lord has done. I wish I could sing that song with the voice of that lady who sang. It was so beautiful, very beautiful song. And, you know, when we move from matters heavenly to matters very earthly, economics, it's my pleasure to be able to speak to you on this day on really what's been happening on the state of the economy. I was given about 25 minutes to walk you through the state of the economy, to update you. Obviously, for some of you, you remember I was with you exactly the same venue 1 year ago, and a lot has happened since, and I look forward to updating you. In terms of the agenda for today, we'll start with global developments in terms of the agenda. We'll obviously look at the global developments, what's been happening outside Kenya, because what happens outside Kenya, somebody mentioned the Strait of Hormuz. What is that all about, and what does that mean for us in Kenya? So I'll talk briefly about what's happened outside Kenya. Then we'll talk about really our macroeconomic performance. How has our economy been performing here in Kenya? Then, of course, we'll talk about the matters fiscal policy, monetary policy, that creature called the National Infrastructure Fund. So many questions about it. Everybody's asking, what is this new creature called the National Infrastructure Fund? What will it do for us? And what are its benefits? What are its pros? Then we'll talk about what are the risks? What does it mean for us now in terms of risks and opportunities here at this graduation, the PDI graduation? What does it mean in terms of what are the emerging risks? What are the emerging opportunities that are coming up from our analysis? And of course, we'll open up to a Q&A. So if I say something that triggers a question or a thought, please note it down somewhere. Then we can have a question and answer session. That'll be the order. So globally, obviously, what's been top of mind has been the US-Israel-Iran war. But let me jog your memory to last year. Last year around this time, April, I was here and I was telling you what the IMF was saying last year. In fact, one thing I like about this event, it always happens immediately after the IMF spring meetings. It's very interesting. So the IMF has two major meetings every year, in April and in October. So if you ever want to know what the IMF is saying, look at the month of April and look at the month of October. And last year, when I was here, I told you the IMF had said that the global economic order was changing. In fact, they said the world as we've known it since 1945, that's when the IMF was formed, the World Bank, the United Nations, the end of the Second World War. That world that has been 80 years old had come to an end. So I remember we really hit that message very, very hard, and it was a call to action. What does it mean? It means the world is changing. Basically, the world as we've known it the last 80 years. Who here is over 80 years old? Nobody. Is anyone over 80? So it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. And that's what we said last year from the IMF. Following that, people are asking, so what does it mean to be in a new global economic order? What does it really mean? In fact, when the president of Finland visited Kenya last year, he again repeated that message that we are entering a new global economic order, and Kenya is going to be a very significant player in that global economic order. That's what he said right here in Nairobi at State House. So a lot of people have been asking, so this global economic order, what will be changing? And of course, nobody knew what will be changing. But obviously, when we came this year, we've seen things we never imagined we would see. We saw on March 1st, US attacking Iran, for what a lot of people never ever thought the US-Iran war would ever come to be. In fact, many people called it a World War III. So it was a very strange time, and of course, it's led to the oil markets being disrupted. Much of the oil we have in Kenya, especially in Kenya, where we have something called the G2G arrangement, all our fuel comes from the Gulf. So that has been intercepted when the US attacked Iran, the US and Israel attacked Iran, one of the economic levers Iran has discovered is they can use what was called the Strait of Hormuz. This is a very narrow channel, maybe about 20 kilometers long, where ships pass to transport oil from the Gulf to other countries in the world. 20% of the world's energy comes from the Middle East and goes through that channel. So they quickly realized that when America has missiles and drones and warships, they can close that 20 kilometer. And they actually put mines in it. It's interesting how you can put mines in water. So you can't really pass without the authority. And that, I think, caught the Americans off guard, and it has really changed the global dynamic. So it means no ship can pass through. And you remember in Kenya in 2024, we signed a G2G deal, which means all our fuel comes from Saudi Arabia, comes from Gulf, the UAE. So we don't have oil from other parts of the world. For example, in Ghana, I saw Ghana were going to see Dangote in Nigeria to see whether they could get oil from his refineries. But Kenya, we have that contract where all our oil. So it has put us in a challenging situation where we saw fuel prices going up. We saw up to $94 per barrel. But even here locally, we saw fuel prices going up. Now the government responded by reducing the VAT on fuel prices, first from 16% to 13%, and again from 13% to 8%. People still feel it's still quite expensive because fuel affects everything. It affects your transport, affects your food, affects the cost of living. So that is something the government right now is really grappling with, and it's going to be a talking point because the ceasefire between US and Iran doesn't seem to be holding. They talked about a ceasefire last week, Friday, but a few days later they said there is no deal on the table. So it's one thing we need to monitor because a lot of our Kenyan fuel is in the ships that are coming in. Obviously, we found other sources that created a bit of an issue because they say it was substandard. That has triggered a bit of an issue, but it's one of the huge talking points right now, the fuel market and how much reserves we have as a country. I think the government has said we still have enough reserves, and it's going to affect us globally and internationally. So it's one thing that the government is trying to do by reducing VAT, but still the price is significantly high, and it will cause, depending on how long it stays, it could have an impact on inflation and prices, which I'll talk about. The next major event has been the IMF spring meetings that I've said. So last week, a lot of our leaders were in Washington, D.C. for the April IMF meetings. As I said, this happens every April and every October. And typically, the way these meetings work, we have our treasury officials, central bank governors, they are there, and they have a plenary meeting such as this, where all the ministers of finance, all the ministers of treasury, central bank governors are addressed. And the IMF said that they are seeing global growth slowing down because of what's happening in the Gulf. So what they call the geopolitical crisis in terms of fuel. And by the way, in terms of fuel, there's two things we need to understand. There is that Strait of Hormuz that I've mentioned, which can be resolved in one day. Basically, they could just say that strait is opened and everything goes back to normal. But there's a deeper issue of the damage that has been done to the refineries. So in that time, Iran has been hitting Kuwait, hitting Saudi Arabia, hitting UAE, and it's been targeting those energy installations. So even if the Hormuz was opened today, it would still take a lot of time to repair the damage that's been done to those refineries. And the reason Iran has been hitting those is because it says that those countries have been hosting US security installations. So it's not just a simple thing of will the Strait of Hormuz be opened or closed, it's also the damage that has been done to those facilities. The damage could take months, could take years to restore. So there's still a nice, and that's why the IMF said they are seeing global growth slowing down, regardless of what the US and Iran do. Obviously, the sooner they can agree to a situation, the better. But of course, there is some repair that has to be done. So that's one of the huge talking points that the IMF told everybody. Now, in those meetings too, they have small meetings with countries, individual countries. So when they met Kenya, they also had some issues with Kenya, where they said Kenya is not disclosing all its debt. It's important for Kenya to disclose all its debt. The debt we normally disclose is the debt on our bonds, corporate bonds, government bonds, bills. But they are saying, no, also the securitization you've been doing, that is debt. Please add that to the books. The pending bills you have with your contractors, that is also debt. And it's something I've been saying for quite a long time, that when the government owes a contractor, let's say you've built a road, but you've not been paid, and it's taken 2, 3, 4 months, that is actually debt. But it's never been really treated as debt by government. You know, the way government is so keen on paying bonds on time, it was a challenge in terms of paying contractors. And I used to say, that is also debt. Yes, you don't owe it to international investors, but you owe it to your business people who need that money to restock. So the same message was relayed to them, that they need to add all pending bills, to put that as public debt. And also, they need to look at issues of corruption. In fact, the conversation has stalled a bit because there's a delay on reports on governance and corruption. So those are some weighty things that the Kenyan team had to absorb from the IMF. But basically, these are the things that they were told that they have to sort it out before they can get any loan facility from the IMF. And right now, many countries are going to the IMF because of this Strait of Hormuz, the global energy issues. So this is a time that even countries that were not thinking of some IMF support now are like, okay, maybe we do need. And so the IMF is flexing its muscle. So those are the two things that have been happening at the global. There's a lot more, but in the interest of time, those are the two ones that let me highlight. Now let me come domestically, now to Kenya, where we are. How is our macroeconomic performance looking? I'll start with inflation. If you look at inflation, again, right now it's at 4.4%. You remember we target an inflation of 5%. Some of the key food items, we're still seeing high inflation on some key food items. Look at cabbages, 33%, tomatoes, 23%. So there's still some pockets where we're seeing high inflation. But for the most part, our inflation remains low, actually a bit too low. Surprisingly, that's what a lot of people get surprised to hear. So when you look at the number on the top left corner, what is called core inflation, that number is at 2.1%. That's a very low number. And that points, again, I think I've said this many times, when you have very low inflation, again, it points to weak demand, weak purchasing power. We are not seeing the purchasing power being strong enough in the economy. And that's why you have very low core inflation. So we have a core inflation of 2.1. We need to have inflation at around 5%. So that's one thing that a lot of policymakers still struggle to understand, because in many parts of the world, we struggle with very high inflation. You go to Nigeria, they have 30%. You go to Egypt, 20%. So the problem of very low inflation is not sometimes internalized, but it points to weak demand, very weak. Our people don't have the purchasing power that they need to meet their daily ends. And that's where the policies need to look at. And why has purchasing power reduced? People ask, why has purchasing power reduced? And I think you can see it in the next slide. One of the reasons we've seen, so even before I go to that next slide, even if you look at the CBK survey, just that CBK survey, it points to the same thing. We're still seeing a bit of weak purchasing power among our people. So every time the CBK does a survey of CEOs, it talks to many CEOs, and they express their confidence or their concerns. What are making our CEOs feel confident about the economy? Many of them talk about a stable macroeconomic environment. Others talk about favorable weather conditions. We've had good weather. Others talk about the ongoing digital transformation which is happening. But what are the things that are making them concerned? Many of them are concerned that the consumer demand in the economy is quite low, the high cost of credit, the rising cost of doing business, and again, the supply chain disruptions. So that demand again, and demand is what drives an economy. So it's very important that we try and restore that demand, because actually it's quite low and it's what's driving business lack of activity. So again, back to that question, why is the consumer demand weak? Why is the customer purchasing power weak? And it's tied to many things, and I'll show it in the next slide. I think it comes down to some of the deductions we've seen over the last few years. You remember the affordable housing levy came, that took away 1.5% from your pay slip. You remember we had the shift that came, it took away 2.75%. NSSF deductions, they have been going up every year. I think this past February they went up again to now 6%. So in the course of 3, 4, 5 years, we've seen your paycheck has been almost slashed by close to 10%. And you've not talked about the inflation, which again erodes purchasing power. So these deductions again have weighed heavily on the pay slip. And that's why again we try to call for some reprieve. There's a big push right now by the Kenya Bankers Association to try and reduce the taxation for people earning below 30,000 shillings. Actually, for everybody. First, the government proposed for every people earning below 30,000 shillings, but they were saying if you could get taxes down by 5% across the board, then we can get more money in our pockets and we can spend more. So there's a big, big push. But the government is in a tight debt situation. They have to pay their debts. And that's one of the things the IMF was not happy with Kenya. You see, the IMF, they said Kenya has reduced its VAT on fuel. So they get concerned how Kenya will pay its debt. Because remember, the IMF is very always concerned about debt sustainability. So there's been that tension between the government and the IMF. The IMF said if you reduce that VAT on fuel, you lose 13 billion shillings. Where are you going to get that 13 billion shillings? But the government has said we need to give our people the reprieve. Times are tough, fuel costs are high. So there's been that push and pull between the two, because the government is thinking about the citizens, but the IMF is thinking about how its loans will be repaid. So it looks at those revenue streams. But these are the deductions that I showed on that slide that have been a big part. So this year, as we approach the finance bill, we'll again be pushing a lot to see if can we reduce some of these things, like the NSSF deduction that came in February. Again, it was quite, it had an impact on the economy in February. In fact, I remember I was at an art cafe and I remember I was asking the manager, how is business? And she told me, since February, sales are down, things are not happening as much as they used to. And I could quickly in my mind tie it to some of these new deductions. So again, we are trying to advise our government as we approach the fiscal, this Q2 is normally the fiscal pillar, to try and provide more reprieve, especially that policy the government had come into place of people earning below 30,000, not paying, reducing their taxes. I think that was a fantastic idea, but it seems to have been shelved somewhere. Next, another thing that the central bank has been trying, again, has been trying to reduce interest rates to try and provide that reprieve. So even they are cognizant that purchasing power is quite low. So even them, they're trying to reduce interest rates, but it's a slow process. Again, we try to tell them, let's move a bit faster, but we are saying we are moving in the right direction in terms of interest rates, but at a slower pace. So again, how can we speeden it up? So somebody wants to start a business should be able to get good access to credit to be able to start their business very quickly. Moving on, credit growth to the private sector is growing. That's a good story. We are at 6.3%, but you can see we are far below where we were a couple of years ago. Credit to the private sector needs to be growing at 14%. Banks are sitting on a lot of money, and that money needs to start going to businesses because the transformation happens at the private sector with the SMEs. So credit to private sector, yes, we are happy it's going up, but we think it's going up at a slow rate. Again, we need to go back to double digits so we can feel it in our pockets, feel it in our hands. Somebody asked me a question a few days ago. If somebody goes to a bank and borrows a loan to participate in affordable housing, is that credit to private sector or is that credit to the public sector? Because this is a government job. And I told him that's still credit to the private sector because the person doing it is a private consultant. Yes, you are doing a program for the government, but the funds are sitting with you and you're the one deploying it and you're the one paying salaries. So yes, we still consider people who are doing affordable housing projects, in as much as it's a public project, they are conduits and they are part of the private sector. So we're happy it's going, but again, we need to push for more. Now, the shilling again has been a big talking point. The shilling has been flat for a very long time, and that's another question that people keep asking. Is this flatness that we see in the last 2 years, the shilling against the dollar has barely moved? So that's one of the most common questions. Is it artificial? Is it natural? Is it market driven? Because the economics says if you're a net importer, which Kenya is, we import more than we export. If you're a net importer, typically your currency should be depreciating over time. But we've seen that flatness. The central bank again keeps saying that they're just getting a lot of dollars from abroad when they sell euro bonds from investors who are confident. So that's one of the arguments that the central bank are saying. That said, over the last few days, there has been a change in sentiment because one of the ways that the central bank keeps the currency as it is, they sell dollars into the economy. As they sell the dollars into the economy, it keeps the shilling at that level. But now, because of this oil crisis in the Gulf, there are concerns that we might have balance of payment issues with importation of oil. Remember the G to G arrangement, we are getting oil on credit and you pay that credit within 6 months. So there's a feeling now that the government needs to conserve those dollars to be able to meet any price increases. So the extent to which the government can still sell dollars into the economy to keep that exchange rate flat is actually quite limited. So I'm seeing a lot of analysts now are revising their projections. I think many of us agreeing now we'll probably be at 132. We are probably going to be at 132 moving forward as we move, because the government now will not want to use its dollar reserves, which are in good shape, but they will not want to use its dollar reserves to manage the currency when there's an oil problem coming in. They'll rather keep those dollars to sort out the oil problems, which means they'll leave the currency to move where it needs to move. So we are seeing us moving towards 132. That's what we are working with. I've seen analysts talking about 132, possibly even more. Again, the CBK has spent a lot of time also removing liquidity from the system. Remember, an exchange rate is the ratio of dollars to shillings in an economy. Yes, you can pump in dollars, but also removing shillings from the market also stabilizes. And last year, about 9 trillion was taken out. And for me, this is a bit of a concern because this is liquidity that needs, again, to move to businesses, to move into the economy. So when it's taken out, yes, it's good for the exchange rate, but it will have an impact on the business and you feel that crunch. Moving on, in terms of the growth, how are we doing in terms of growth? There's a diversity of opinion in terms of how 2026 will fare off. We are seeing the IMF saying we'll grow at 4.5% in 2025, and the Treasury is saying 5.3%. So there seems to be a disparity between the two. And what are the sectors that we are seeing a lot of growth? We'll be seeing growth in terms of, especially in the services. So agriculture is very weather dependent, but services are very is where Kenya really gets a lot of growth. So we are seeing accommodation and food services growing into double digits and really driving that economic transformation. However, some of these sectors might be affected by the fuel prices, such as transport and storage. Of course, that will be affected. Manufacturing might be affected, but manufacturing, again, has been facing a lot of challenges, not least because of the taxation. One critical thing that keeps coming up, if you look at construction, one of the line items, I know the numbers are a bit small, but you'll see the line item for construction was negative in 2024. And people keep asking, how can construction be having negative growth, yet we are seeing a lot of affordable housing projects coming up? How can construction be negative? That has brought up a lot of debate. But the one opportunity I had to meet with the governor, the CBK governor, and he said construction combines both road construction and house construction. So yes, the houses were being built. We are seeing a lot of growth, but in terms of road construction, that had taken a bit because of pending bills. There are contractors who had downed their tools because they had not been paid. This was back in 2024. There was a time there was no construction on roads happening. Thankfully, a lot of those contractors were paid, and that's why you see that number moving forward became a positive and became a positive growth. So when you think about construction, don't just think of houses, but also roads. So that number is collapsed, and I think a lot of the contractors have been paid, and now we are seeing people back to work and building those roads. Moving forward, fiscal policy, very quickly on fiscal policy, we are approaching the budget. In fact, next week, we expect the budget policy statement to be published, and that's when now we'll really start the issue of budget 2026. We expect to see a big deficit of 1 trillion shillings. What is a deficit? A deficit is just the difference between the revenue you get and the expenditure. So when you have more expenses than you have in terms of revenue, it means you have a hole of 1 trillion. And how is that hole filled? Through borrowing. So this year, the next fiscal year, we expect government to borrow about 1 trillion shillings. And I've registered my concerns about that because when government is very big on borrowing, it means you crowd out the private sector. So when you have 1 trillion, so part of that trillion, half of it will be borrowed externally, another half of it will be borrowed domestically. But again, my concern is the central bank is doing very good work in trying to lower interest rates. When the government comes and starts raising its borrowing, those interest rates start going back up. So while the left hand is giving, the right hand is undoing. So again, we'll be challenging government to try and reduce the borrowing, because the more you borrow, the more money that could be going to Windsor, to do its expansion in places like these, ends up in government bonds and bills. So that's why we're telling government, let's review this budget. Let's not borrow so much because it takes us back to issues. So moving on. In terms of where will the money be going to, obviously education is the biggest line item. Education will be taking up 766 billion. The energy, ICT infrastructure, about 500 billion. And I'll talk a bit about that later with the issue of the National Infrastructure Fund. But you can see energy will be taking up the largest item, about 700 billion. And another question that keeps up coming a lot, people ask, if education is our largest expenditure as a budget, why is it that we are sending our young people abroad? Why is it that we're investing in their education? We are giving them education to be the best doctors, we are sending them to Australia. The best engineers, we are sending them to Germany. So it's becoming very controversial, the policy of sending young people abroad to look for jobs, yet our biggest investment is education. At what point are we going to recoup the investments we are making in our education? So which means we need to create more jobs locally. We need to create more jobs locally so that people can go abroad as a secondary option, greener pastures. But I am not for this idea that the government's employment creation strategies to send people to Saudi Arabia, to the Middle East. Those should be additional opportunities. But the government, we have a sole responsibility to create good business environment so people can find jobs here. So again, that's a big disconnect. Our huge investment in education, but with the returns that we are exporting abroad. Moving on. Again, very quickly on our debt levels, we are at 55% of GDP. Again, we need to reduce that. We need to be at 60. We need to be at 55. We are at 63.8. So for every 100 shillings that we're raising, we're spending a lot of money in terms of servicing debt. In fact, the next slide puts it in a more critical way. There's something called the CFS. The CFS stands for the Consolidated Fund. This is the fund that handles matters pensions, government debt, and such. The CFS is one that pays debt and stuff. If you look at the percentage that has been going to the CFS from revenue, back in 2013 was at 48%. It was at 16%, and that number has gone up to 48%. So again, yes, we are paying our taxes, but too much of our taxes is going towards paying debts, and we need that money to do more development. So again, it's the same theme. Let's reduce our debt level so we can have more money for education, for healthcare, for security. Again, that's a recurring theme. Moving forward, monetary policy, I think I mentioned it. CBK has been trying its best to lower interest rates, but that process can quickly be undone by the National Treasury if it continues increasing its borrowing. So what the left hand is trying to give is being taken away by the right hand. So that disconnect, we need to fix it. Moving forward, reserves remain strong. I'll not say too much about that. Just this is what the CBK has been taking pride in. We have very strong foreign reserves, but as I said, there seems to be a change of thinking. Instead of using these reserves to try and intervene in the currency markets, there'll be a push to try and now reserve it for matters fuel on oil, which means they'll probably allow the exchange rate now to move where it needs to move. So that's why I said we are talking about a 132 as we approach the midpoint and endpoint of this year. Next, so this issue of the National Infrastructure Fund, very critical. So this fund has been created. It's a company. It's actually a bank. It's actually a bank. Just they don't want to use the word bank, but it's called the National Infrastructure Fund. So the thinking from the government has been our investment in infrastructure is very expensive. I've just showed you the numbers. Actually, after education, the next biggest line item is infrastructure and energy. And the thinking in government is when you borrow for these mega projects, you increase your country's debt. So if you talk about the standard gauge railway, Kenya's largest infrastructure project ever, It costs probably about $3-4 billion. And the loans you are being given from the Chinese maybe are 7 years, 10 years, not because infrastructure projects pay in the very, very long term. They don't pay in the short term. But the loans you are getting from the Chinese are needed in 7 years, in 10 years. So the thinking within the government is let's move all these mega infrastructure projects that are commercially viable into the National Infrastructure Fund so that the government, it does not affect the government's fiscal space. Because one infrastructure project, I remember one person saying, one energy project alone can build 5,000 schools. So the thinking there has been remove these big projects that are very expensive and commercially viable, put them into that fund, capitalize that fund, and where do you get the capital from? Sell shares of parastatals, of Safaricom, Kenya Pipeline, put those as seed money, then I'll call in pension funds to come in to top up the rest. So for every 1 shilling the government puts into that fund, pension funds will put 10 shillings and they'll do these mega projects which will be off the balance sheet of the government, and now the government can focus on now doing projects around school, around healthcare, projects that are not very heavy. So that's been the thinking from the government. Let's move these things off the budget so that we don't get ourselves into deep debt. The challenge, though, is infrastructure, for the most part, is a public good, which needs to be done by the government. Since independence, all our infrastructure has been done by the government. So trying to get Kenyans to think about now paying, because the way these funds will be paying through tolls, it could, in a way, start adding to cost of doing business, cost of access. So that's now the other challenge. When you start having many roads being tolled, because that's how these pension funds, when they build this infrastructure, that's how they recoup their money. You'll be paying tolls. And that could become a bit of an issue. I was talking to an Australian friend of mine. He's a journalist in Australia, and he was telling me, in Australia, you go, almost all the roads are tolled. So for him to go and see his mother somewhere, he has to pay almost 3, 4, 5 tolls. And he was telling me, be careful, Kenya does not go there, because in a way it can make the cost of doing business. And he told me his brother runs a trucking company. In fact, in Australia, trucks have to use tolled roads. Trucks cannot use public roads. So it introduces the culture of tolling, which might also add to the cost of business. So those are the sort of the to and fro's. Yes, government, it's removing it from its obligations, but now it's handing those obligations to citizens, because the way you'll be paying them will be through tolls. So it's a big debate. People are saying infrastructure should be left to government. We don't want the issue of tolls. But government is saying we do need quality roads. We do need efficient roads. One of the examples that has been given is the issue of the expressway, where they say, look at the expressway, it's increased efficiency. People are able to go from Westlands to Syokimau in minutes. But that is a bit different. If you look at the expressway, it's a bit unique, because the expressway has the expressway component and you have the public road component. So you can choose as a citizen how to use what they call upstairs or downstairs. So there's an option. But if you look at the Mau Summit Road, there's actually no free option. Once it's tolled, there'll actually be no, unless you start going through Suso, but there's no parallel road. And that's why I say using the expressway as an example is not good, because the expressway gives you 2 options which you can choose. But some of the other projects that are coming up, you'll actually be forced to pay. There'll be no parallel, like the Mau Summit Way has no parallel road for people who don't want to pay tolls. So that's a bit problematic. So I think there's still a bit of a debate there that needs to happen in terms of cost of doing business. If you're transporting goods, potatoes every day, what does that mean? Because they'll be charging 9 shillings per kilometer, and the Mau Summit will be 175 kilometers. So if you're going the whole 9 yards and back, it can be quite expensive. So some of the debates that are taking place. Very quickly, in terms of what are the opportunities and the risks, let me start with the risks first. Some of the risks we are seeing is globally, of course. This US, Iran, Israel situation is very untidy, especially for us here in Kenya, where we depend on fuel. People ask about Ngamia 1. What happened to Ngamia 1? Where we were supposed to we discovered oil in Turkana. We were supposed to use it, but we've never used it. So maybe those are some of the things that might be triggered as we move forward. How do we start using our own resources instead of constantly depending on resources abroad? Again, another risk I see is heavy government borrowing. We'll crowd out the private sector. That's a big challenge. As I said, we're looking at a deficit of 1 trillion shillings. If government borrows all that market domestically, or even half of it, it means you and I have little to access from the banking sector. We are seeing aggressive revenue collection from KRA. Again, that could have an impact on business. I think you saw the KRA head was removed a few weeks ago. They're looking for a replacement, and people have been saying the KRA has been very aggressive in collecting revenue. They came up with something called the special table. I don't know if anybody has heard the special table, but it's a very draconian way of getting taxes. So people are saying about that. Then the issue of unemployment. We're getting to June 25th, where we'll be marking 2 years since that Gen Z uprising. People are saying that could trigger some issues, as well as our very abrasive politics, the rise of goonism. I think that's been a theme over the last few weeks, very abrasive goonism. Those are the risks. And what are the opportunities that we see? Lastly, the opportunities. I think in terms of opportunities, we are seeing things like artificial intelligence coming in. And AI could transform our lives in many ways. AI could unlock productivity in things that we never thought possible. Things that could take us 1 year, in the click of a button, you could do it with AI. So we are seeing AI unlocking a lot of productivity for individuals, for companies, for the country. I know Kenya now has a national AI strategy, which I think is very progressive. So I think AI is something, I know some people have been trying to fight it, but I think it's something that we try and incorporate it in our business, in our personal lives. It can unlock a lot of productivity and make you do what you would have paid a consultant to do. Now you can do it at your fingertips. That's one thing. We are seeing interest rates from the US. Once we see lower interest rates in the US, we'll find a lot of money starting to come to Kenya. And actually, this issue of the disruption in the Middle East, in a way, could turn out to be a blessing for Kenya. Why do I say that? A lot of the multinationals in the world have their regional headquarters, what they call EMEA, Europe, Middle East, Africa, in Dubai. So disruption in Dubai actually is going to trigger a conversation by these big multinationals on where else can we be setting up our base. And Kenya has very good human capital, very good, it's a peaceful country. The weather is great, the people are great. So if our public officials play their cards right, you might find a lot of the multinationals asking why the Africa headquarters should be in Dubai. Why is it not in Nairobi? So that's a big opportunity. They say every cloud has a silver lining. So we might actually see multinationals saying the Middle East is a bit unstable. We actually think there could be opportunity here. Of course, infrastructure development, especially in the counties. A lot of the counties, we talk about infrastructure, but it's still in the urban areas. We need a lot more investments in the rural areas, those roads that can open up tourism, open up agriculture. Those are the things that we're getting instead. And lastly, it's our young educated workforce. We have a young population, median age is 19 years. They are willing to they are very tech savvy. They'll come up with every idea we have. How do we pull them together to be able to transform this country more? That's one of the reasons multinationals come to Kenya. They say our labor force is extremely talented. We speak good English. Our IT levels are very good. We can do a lot more. So these are the things that I think if our policymakers can pay, there are a lot more. But these are some of the things that continue to make Kenya attractive. We're a diversified economy. And if we continue to build on these, then those risks that I mentioned will be easily mitigated. With that said, I think my time is well spent. Thank you so much.